Okay, welcome back everybody to a new semester. We again have attendance sheets so that I get reimbursed for the snacks and drinks. And with that, I will hand over to Anna to introduce.
Yeah. All right, welcome this afternoon to the first joint colloquium of the season of summer. I'm very pleased and happy to welcome Anna Gallazzi back to Heidelberg. You will understand why in a moment. And to welcome her to our joint astronomy colloquium. So Anna carried out her PhD at MPA in Garching under the supervision of Stéphane Charlot and Simon White, after which in 2006 she moved to MPIA here on the hill in Heidelberg as a postdoc with Eric Bell. In 2010, she obtained the Dark Fellowship at the Dark Cosmology Center in Copenhagen, so we had to say goodbye to Anna. And after 3 years, Anna got a Marie Curie Fellowship, which brought her back to Italy, to the Arcetri Observatory in Florence, where she later became associate researcher. Throughout these years, Anna has established herself as an internationally renowned expert in the analysis of integrated stellar populations from spectroscopic surveys, from redshift, so from the local universe, say, to redshift 1. And today she will take us through her studies of galaxy stellar properties between redshift 0 and 1. The podium is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna. So do you hear me well? Good. Yes, so thank you very much, Anna, and thanks the organizers for this invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be back here in Heidelberg, and it's an honor to start this season. It's really impressive to be in this room on this side and not on the other side. So as Anna said, today I'm gonna talk to you about the properties of stellar populations in galaxies from the local universe up to redshift below 1, so in about half of the cosmic history, and how we use the stellar populations in galaxies as fossil records of galaxy evolution. And I actually would like also to acknowledge here the contribution from my principal collaborators, Stefano Di Betti, Daniele Matturini, and Laura Scholz-Diaz in Arcetri, Anna Pasquali as well, with whom we've worked a lot along the years, and the main people in the legacy team, and also Francesco Valentino and Pompei Zu on recent work we're doing on redshift galaxies. So why do we say that stellar population properties in galaxies are fossil records? Well, they are basically the end product of the integrated history of star formation, matter recycling, and mass assembly in galaxies. And so they are a result of complex interplay between internal recycling of gas through star formation and metal production and recycling within galaxies, which are also affected by both internal mechanisms that regulate the efficiency of star formation and chemical enrichment, and external properties through inflow of gas from outside galaxies, from the CGN and the filaments, and how much gas can be removed from galaxies. So all these mechanisms alter and regulate the star formation efficiency and matter recycling, and would leave a different imprint on the physical properties of present-day stellar populations in galaxies. And the main properties that we're going to hear during this talk are the mean age of the stellar populations, which basically traces the main epoch of the star formation, the mass build-up, although sensitive to recent star formation, modulated by recent star formation, the metallicity of the stellar populations, which is actually an average over the whole star formation histories and traces abundances of both iron and alpha elements. And so it's an indication of the overall efficiency of star formation and matter enrichment. And the abundance ratios, different elements, and chiefly the alpha over iron abundance ratios, which depends, it's an indication of the relative effective yield of type 2 supernovae versus type 1a supernovae, and that physically can be interpreted as an indication of the star formation timescales, but it's also, of course, very much dependent on the IMF. So the physical interpretation of this quantity is more complicated. So studying the stellar populations, the present-day stellar population in galaxies is what is called the archaeological approach of inferring the past history of galaxy formation, and basically trying to, infer these physical properties and correlate them with indicators of the integral of the star formation history, so chiefly the total stellar mass formed, or indicators of the assembly history through the dynamical mass of the structure of galaxies. And these scaling relations have been, this approach actually goes back to the early 80s or even before with the Teasley work. And the community has widely studied the properties of early type galaxies, by quiescent galaxies in the local universe, which have then been established with large spectroscopic surveys such as SDSS. And we know that the more massive quiescent galaxies today host the older and matter-richer, more alpha-enhanced stellar populations, which are consistent with, interpreted with earlier and faster formation for the most massive ellipticals. And these scaling relations are actually very important constraints for galaxy formation models, for the efficiency of the quenching, and different mechanisms of matter recycling. This is a very powerful approach, but in all these, we have to remember that these scaling relations are just a snapshot in time of the population of galaxies. These should not be interpreted as evolutionary tracks. They're also somewhat blind to the assembly history of galaxies, in the sense that they tell us when stars were formed, but not directly where. And also, when we look at the stellar population in present-day galaxies, they're typically old, and so the spectroscopic indicators of the stellar population properties are limited, the intrinsic limitation in the age resolution, so we cannot really resolve the early phases of the star formation activity. A complementary approach to the evolution of galaxies, what we call it a direct look-back approach, whereby people make a census of galaxy populations across cosmic time, and we know from the evolution of the cosmic star formation rate density and the number density of galaxies, the function of mass, that the last 10 billion years, the cosmic history, have experienced a significant decline, a drop in the overall star formation activity, which is accompanied by a growth of the massive and passive galaxy populations. And in recent years, JWST is establishing also the observations of the early appearance at a redshift above 3 of massive and quiescent galaxies, possibly overabundant with respect to observations. So we see the coexistence of a decline in star formation and the emergence of massive quiescent galaxies. But this approach has, of course, an intrinsic difficulty in actually connecting progenitors and descendant population of galaxies unless we have a more detailed understanding of their physical properties. And this is why the way to go is to actually combine these approaches and perform an archaeological investigation of galaxies through cosmic time and try and characterize the physical properties of galaxy populations at different snapshot in time, the cosmic history, and trace the scaling relations closer to the peak of the cosmic star formation histories, and also gain in time resolution, because as we move to higher redshift, the populations are younger, and eventually the goal would be to statistically but physically connect populations of descendant and progenitor galaxies. For these, we need actually to perform a large and deep spectroscopic surveys of representative galaxy samples, so volume representative, including both quiescent and star-forming galaxies, across cosmic time, so at least up to redshift 1 or even above, sampling absorption features in the rest frame optical. And this leads me to say a few words about how we can derive stellar population properties for galaxies. We need the spectra, and in particular spectra that sample the rest frame optical and possibly extend into the rest frame UV, because that is the region where we have key absorption features that have chiefly and distinct sensitivity to different stellar population properties. And the goal is actually to combine diagnostics such as the 4000 Armstrong break, the Balmer lines, magnesium and iron indices that are as orthogonal as possible in parameter space, so in breaking the generacies between age, recent star formation, metallicities, and element abundance ratios. Now, of course, this needs to be interpreted then, and for this we need population synthesis models that predict the evolution of the spectral evolution of simple stellar populations with a given age and a given chemical composition. The galaxies are, of course, not simple stellar populations, so this needs to be convolved with complex star formation histories. And in the community, since about in the last 20 years or so, I've developed different tools to interpret the spectra, and have different degrees of complexity in the various ingredients, in the star formation histories, in the metallicity or metallicity histories, in the implementation of dust attenuation, the allowance of variations in element abundance ratios, and assumptions on the initial mass function. So let me just spend briefly a few words on our method. This is because most of the results are coming from our group that I'm going to show are based on this, which is called the BASTA, which is the Bayesian stellar population analysis. So we perform Bayesian inference of stellar population properties through comparison of spectroscopic indices with population synthesis models convolved with a stochastic Monte Carlo library of star formation histories and chemical enrichment history. So basically, this is very simple representation of the method. We build a large and comprehensive library of model spectra, for which we derive synthetic observables, which are compared to real galaxy observations, and derive the posterior probability density function of physical parameters that we're interested in, chiefly the mass weighted and light weighted ages and stellar metallicity, stellar mass, and dust attenuation. And the nice thing in general of Bayesian approaches is that they provide uncertainties that include not just the observational uncertainties on the absorption features, but of the intrinsic underlying degeneracies between the physical parameters. And so we use a library of 500,000 models based on the DB19 simple stellar population models, complex star formation histories with a rising and declining component plus stochastic burst. We implement histories of chemical enrichment and the dust treatment. And as I said, the principal diagnostics are optimally selected to be sensitive, differently sensitive to age and metallicity, so absorption features in combination with photometry. That said, I would like to guide you through what we know about the stellar population properties in present-day galaxies before, as in this first part of the talk, before moving to higher redshift. And I'd like to start by showing this latest, most recent rendition of the scaling relations between luminosity weighted age and stellar mass and stellar metallicity as a function of stellar mass that has been obtained by Daniele Mattolini, a PhD student in Arcetri. Confirming, corroborating what we have already know of the existence of what are called the chemoarchaeological downsizing trends in present-day galaxies. This is the general galaxy populations, such that more massive galaxies as I said, the beginning for early type galaxies, but this pertains also to star forming. More massive galaxies contain older and metal-richer stellar populations, and we see a transition from a low-mass metal-poor regime, young metal-poor regime, to an old metal-rich regime across the characteristic stellar mass, which is here estimated to be 6 times 10 to the 10 solar masses. I like to show this plot because these are actually volume and completeness weighted, so this color map actually represents the number density of galaxies, and they're also corrected for aperture effects, so Sloan SDSS spectra are taken through a fiber, so they sample just the central region of galaxies, but in this case we have applied statistical correction to absorption indices that are actually representative of the entire extent of the galaxy. And then another thing to point out, as I will show later in the next slide, there is actually a coexistence of a young and an old sequence over at least an order of magnitude in stellar mass, while there is no bimodality in stellar metallicity. So some of you may be familiar with the 20-year-old plot of the scaling relations derived from SDSS back in my work in 2005. And there are different upgrades in the modeling that actually lead to a change in the transition mass and to an enhancement of the bimodality, to a change in the normalization of the stellar metallicities and the steepness of these relations. So these may have important effect on constraints on mass-dependent quenching mechanism and on the efficiency of chemical enrichment at low masses. So, as I said, the first thing that we notice in the age distribution is that there is a bimodality in the age distribution, such that at a given mass we observe both a young and an old sequence. And you may not be surprised to see that these actually originate primarily from a distinction of different sequences followed by quiescent and star-forming galaxies. So the interesting thing is that this bimodality observed on global scales actually is observed also on local scales. So here we are treating galaxies at one point, basically, so we're just averaging everything. Thanks to integral field spectroscopic surveys, such as in this case Khalifa, we can actually resolve individual regions within galaxies. And we have observed that also on local scales, so individual region of galaxies have a bimodality distribution in age, so that the age of the local stellar populations correlate with the local surface mass density in a way to produce a constant ridge of old regions and a sequence of young regions with increasing age at increasing surface mass density. So this bimodality in age is actually pertains to different structural components in galaxies. So it does not just appear on global scales, but also on local scales. And at a given surface mass density, the mass and the structure of galaxies determine the age of the stellar populations. So there are both a local and a global modulation of the age. What happens for stellar metallicity instead? As I said, there is not a bimodality in this case, but we observe a unimodal relation. But again, if we split passive and star-forming galaxies, we see that they actually follow two different sequences that are joined at the high mass end, but at the lower masses, these two sequences deviate such that passive galaxies are systematically more matter-rich than equally massive star-forming galaxies. And these observations was also obtained in previous works, and it can actually be interpreted in terms of as indicative of different mechanisms of quenching. And for example, in Krasov 2020 work, they modeled this difference with a quenching through starvation, so at a rather long time scales, such that star formation continues in a in an interstellar medium that is not diluted anymore by the accretion of low metal poor gas and by the efficient outflows at low masses. But it's not the only interpretation. Another interpretation through models of chemical enrichment is that actually present-day early-type galaxies had a more efficient star formation at early epochs with respect to the present-day star-forming galaxies, which had a more secular evolution. Another factor that may complicate the analysis, that adds another level of analysis, is actually the structural properties of galaxies, because similarly to what we see for age, there is actually a local counterpart in the mass metallicity relation. So this is now, again, from Khalifa data, showing the stellar metallicity as a function of the local surface mass density in individual regions in galaxies. As I showed before, for the age, there are two distinct sequences of an old ridge and the blue sequence. But if we plot the local mass metallicity relation for these two sequences, actually, they follow the same relation. So there is a single relation between the local stellar metallicity and the local surface mass density, which is independent of age, which at face value is somewhat contrast with the picture that we saw on global scales, whereby the old passive galaxies are metal richer than the young star-forming galaxies. And it actually, this difference may actually originate from a structure differences between passive and star-forming galaxies, so by the existence of a local stellar metallicity surface mass density relation and the different surface mass density profiles structure of quiescent and star-forming galaxies. This relation is also, this spread is actually associated to the different total mass ranges of galaxies. So again, mass acts as, we like to call it, a local parameters, in the simultaneously as global and local parameter driver of the chemical enrichment in galaxies. So, but let me say a few words more about the dependence of the metallicity on the present-day star formation activity of galaxies. So we saw there is a difference between passive and star-forming galaxies, but there seems to be more than that, actually, a dependence of the stellar metallicity on the level of the star formation activity itself. This is well known for the gas phase component, where we know that with the so-called fundamental metallicity relation, such that the stellar metallicity is a function both of the stellar mass and the star formation rate. But recent works, and this one is a work in preparation by Daniele Mattolini, are actually indicating that this is evident also for the stellar component in galaxies. So this shows the star formation rate versus stellar mass plane, color-coded by the stellar metallicity. You see a gradient indicating that the stellar metallicity depends both on the stellar mass and the star formation rate. And we can see it more clearly by slicing this plane into galaxies located at different distances from the star-forming main sequence. And you see that while galaxies that are on the quiescent cloud, so here, they are basically indistinguishable, but then moving closer or even up of the upward of the main sequence, we see that the stellar metallicity decreases and the relation steepens, pretty much in analogy with the gas phase fundamental metallicity relation. And this is not obvious because while the gas phase metallicity and the star formation rate are tracing similar timescales of the order of 10 or 100 mega-year, the stellar metallicity, as I said at the beginning, is average over the entire star formation history, so it traces longer timescales of the order of a giga-year. So there is a correlation between a long time scale star formation history and metal enrichment with the present-day star formation activity. Interestingly, these were observed and predicted also by both semi-analytic models and also hydrodynamical simulations, although they differ in details, which is, of course, where we'd like to investigate more. But interestingly, again, similar to what's shown in the Gaia semi-analytic models, a fixed star formation rate. The relation, the mass metallicity relation shows different slope, while at fixed specific star formation rate, a different normalization. And in hydrodynamical simulation, this has been interpreted to be associated to the different degree of burstiness in the star formation history and feedback. So far, I've been talking about somewhat internal drivers of the chemical enrichment star formation in galaxies. But of course, galaxies don't live, they're not isolated, but they live and are embedded in a cosmic web, and they are located in different environments, an environment that is also changing with time. And we then may expect, and we know, in fact, that environment also influences the evolution of galaxies. And one way to characterize, parameterize the environment is through, first of all, try and estimate the mass of the halo in which the galaxy resides, and to distinguish between central galaxies, though that sit basically at the center of the potential well, with respect to satellite galaxies, which are those that have been accreted onto the halo. And of course, the history of accretion can be very different. Satellites can enter early on in a halo, or enter first in a smaller group, being preprocessed, and then enter onto a larger halo in the present-day universe. And so satellite galaxies can suffer different cluster-specific processes that alter their gas content and eventually their star formation, while central galaxies can undergo a different evolution, that those that sit at the high-density peaks can be receive accretion of gas through their history. And of course, we expect that the efficiency and the timescales of these processes depend on the halo mass and on the time of infall. And so this is what we are trying to investigate. This plot actually builds on the Anna Pasquali 2010 work, trying to identify an imprint of the environment on the scaling relation of present-day stellar populations. And here we're showing central galaxies in gray and satellite galaxies residing in different halo masses by the colored line. As you can clearly see, while at high masses, centers and satellites basically share the same physical properties, at lower masses there is a strong dependence of the age on the halo mass, and in general, satellites are older and metal-richer with respect to equally massive centrals, both in their stellar component and in the gas phase component. So this is telling two things. Well, first, that if you want to search for metal-rich old galaxies today, you need to look at massive galaxies or satellites in the massive halos. And also that high halo masses somewhat facilitate quenching in galaxies, but also leading to a higher metal enrichment. And the first observations that we know is that the fraction of quiescent galaxies is a function of both the stellar mass and the halo mass. And this resembles pretty much the trend in age that I was showing before. So we may ask whether the effect that we were seeing before are just a reflection of an increased fraction of quiescent galaxies in denser environment, in more massive halos. And to a large extent, this seems to be the case. Now here I'm showing again the same relation, but splitting into star-forming, grain valley, and quiescent galaxies, and you see that the relation virtually overlap. So basically, to first order, the differences between satellites and centrals disappear. So this may indicate a fast transition from star-forming to quiescence, because we're not seeing a gradual transition in their stellar population properties. And I mentioned at the beginning that the element abundance ratio may be an indicator of the time scale of star formation. So we try and look for an imprint of this fast transition in the alpha over iron, but we don't see any. So again, in each of these classes, satellites and centrals overlap in their alpha over iron abundance ratio. That may be interpreted as an indication of an overall quenching time scale. So the alpha over iron is set before by the stellar mass of the galaxy and not by the environment. So this points to the proposed scenario of delayed and then rapid quenching, whereby gas is first stripped in the halo through strangulation processes, and then quickly room pressure deprives the lower metallicity gas in the galaxy disk. So this allows the galaxy to continue star formation, but in an interstellar medium that does not receive any more inflows of metal-poor gas. And the alpha variance would then be set by the galaxy stellar mass. Now, the environment also acts in a different way. So these are an imprint of what we say satellite-specific processes, so something that deprives the satellites from their gas and leaves an imprint on their metal content. But the time when a galaxy became a satellite is also important, and this can be parameterized by the distribution of the position of galaxies in the so-called phase space plane in velocity and projected distance. And Anna in 2019 showed that there is a gradient of the age at a given mass and halo mass. There is a gradient of the age as a function of the location in the phase space, so basically of the time of infall, such that galaxies that fell in earlier on are older with respect to those that are recent infaller. So if we distinguish ancient infallers that fell in the present day halo more than 5 giga-year ago with respect to recent infallers, well, we see that actually it is for the ancient infallers that we see an imprint of environment. This plot here is showing the difference in age, stellar metallicity, and alpha over ion of ancient infaller satellites with respect to equally massive centrals. And we basically detect a small but significant excess in age, total metallicity, and element abundance ratios only for ancient infaller satellites that reside today in the most massive halos of more than 10 to the 14, and that are dominated, for galaxies that are dominated by all the stellar populations. So this probably points to the action of environment earlier on in the history of galaxy formation, probably even, so given the ages of the galaxies that are of the order of 90 giga-years, so even older than the average infall time, they were probably quenched before entering the present day halo. So this probably points to environmental effects that are associated to different initial conditions for galaxies that are located closer to cosmic density peaks, so higher efficiency of star formation. And another indication of this, let me say, nature or assembly bias effect is also seen if we look at the central galaxies only. And in a nice series of papers, Laura Scholz-Diaz showed that the relation between the stellar mass and the halo mass of central galaxies, the scatter in this relation is actually correlated with stellar population properties, such that the galaxies with a higher stellar to halo mass ratios are older. And this is true not only for the integrated galaxy properties, but also for the gradients in stellar populations. These plots are showing the age at different radii in galaxies and the stellar metallicity in different radial beams. So we see that it is the age in the outskirts of galaxies that is influenced by the stellar to the halo mass ratio, while it is the central stellar metallicity that depends on the stellar to halo mass ratio. So galaxies not only have different integrated properties, but also different radial profiles. And this, in general, we see that galaxies with a higher stellar to total dynamical mass relation have properties that are compatible with a more rapid formation in the early phases and build up through accretion in the outskirts, and they're typically more evolved with respect to galaxies with lower stellar to total dynamical mass ratio. And the stellar to halo mass ratio is typically interpreted as an indication of the formation time of the halo and its concentration. So again, earlier formed halos result in more evolved stellar populations. Okay, so I think I've given a quite broad overview of the complex distribution of stellar population properties in present-day galaxies and their different dependencies on internal and external properties. But we want to trace, as I said at the beginning, is how the stellar population properties and the scaling relations in galaxies evolve, at least over the cosmic time of the decline in the cosmic star formation histories. And this is actually has been traditionally quite difficult because, as I said, we need the deep spectroscopy in the rest frame optical to trace accurately the absorption features, so observationally it is quite challenging. And until, well, I would say by now a decade ago, the first pioneering studies on addressing the stellar populations in intermediate redshift were limited in sample size or in sample selection by targeting mostly only quiescent galaxies in clusters. And in our 2014 work, we targeted a mass selected sample, but only limited to 70 galaxies. So but what we want to trace is how the scaling relations evolve with redshift and try and understand how much the evolution can be attributed to the evolution of individual galaxies with respect to the evolution of the population associated to the overall quenching of the star formation activity and the build-up of the quiescent population. So the picture changed basically when deep spectroscopic survey started. And the first one, this redshift interval, is actually the legacy survey, which is still represents kind of the state of the art today. This survey, the PI is Arjan van der Wel, and who was also here in Ireland, but actually the survey started while he was here, and targeted a sample of more than 3,000 galaxies at redshift between 0.6 and 1, mass K-band selected, so it's a representative sample of both the passive and the star-forming population, and integrate in 20 hours, so reaching very good signal-to-noise for the majority of the sample. So the strength of these surveys are the large statistics, the well-defined sample selection, which allows also correction for completeness and for volume, the high spectral quality, which allows robust measurement of the continuum and the absorption features. And that already resulted in a number of analyses of both the stellar component, the kinematics, as well as the gas properties of galaxies. And here in this talk, I would like to show you recent results focused on the scaling relation between age, stellar mass, and the stellar metallicity in legacy galaxies. So applying the BASTA code approach that I mentioned at the beginning. Because we are interested in the stellar metallicity of galaxies, we need to sample the absorption features that trace magnesium and iron abundances, and this imposes a redshift limit in the legacy sample up to redshift 0.77. So we are actually analyzing out of the full legacy sample, only a sample of about 550 galaxies that is representative, so again, comprising both quiescent and star-forming galaxies. And about 300 galaxies of these are what we call the golden samples, so with a signal-to-noise larger than 20, that give us a better control of the quality of the measurement. And so with these, I can actually show you the distribution of redshift 0.7 galaxies in age, stellar metallicity versus mass. These are individual points, and in the bottom panel you see instead the median trend. And as you can see, well, first of all, the first thing to notice is that these archaeological downsizing trends in both age and stellar metallicity are already in place at redshift 0.7, so about 6 gig a year ago. And I actually seem to show a presence of a young and an old sequence that results in this kind of sigmoidal shape of the age-mass relation that transition at the stellar mass of about 1.6 to 10 to the 11 solar masses. That, as you remember from the lower redshift value, this is actually higher, and I will show you that later. While there is no, again, bimodal distribution in metallicity, but a progressive flattening at high stellar masses. Again, these relations are weighted both for volume and completeness, thanks to the sample selection of legacy. As we saw in the local universe, we can actually distinguish quiescent and star-forming galaxies in the age-stellar mass plane, and we see that, again, this transition originates from the superposition of the two different and separate sequences for the star-forming and the passive galaxies, which remain separated also at high masses. If we look instead as a function of the velocity dispersion, we see, of course, a very similar trend of increasing age and with velocity dispersion. But we also see that there is a sharper transition from the young to the old regime at a velocity dispersion of 2.3 in log, indicating, in agreement with other studies, that the velocity dispersion, so the total potential well of the galaxy, may be more predictive of the main formation epoch of galaxies, sort of their average age. But in the old sequence, actually, there is more an overlap of both the quiescent and the star-forming galaxies. So this transition is not associated actually to a quenching, but more to the earlier star formation, but not necessarily to the quenching of galaxies. For what concerns metallicity, again, we can distinguish quiescent and star-forming galaxies. And when we look at these two different sequences, we see a very similar result as was observed in the local universe. Notice, of course, that at this redshift, we are limited to masses above 10 to the 10, while in the lower redshift SDSS sample, we were going down to below 9.5. But this difference between the star-forming and the quiescent sequence is actually also quantitatively consistent with the redshift 0 observations, whereby lower mass star-forming galaxies are typically 0.2 dex metal poorer with respect to the passive galaxies. So this seems to be a property that remains also at this redshift. And similarly, despite the much lower statistics with respect to SDSS, we can actually detect a secondary dependence of the stellar metallicity on the specific star formation rate, also in this case actually parameterized in terms of distance from the main sequence, such that at masses at least below 10.8, the more highly star-forming galaxies, as you move closer to the main sequence, the stellar metallicity decreases. Of course, the statistic is low, and this will need to be followed up by further studies, but when we ask whether this secondary dependence is actually invariant with redshift, so if it is actually a fundamental relation as is observed for the gas phase, and also whether it is associated to structural variation within galaxies. In fact, other works by Angelos and Estesian, for example, showing that more compact quiescent galaxies quenched earlier, faster, and also have a higher metallicity with respect to more extended galaxies in legacy. Another investigation that we're carrying on is whether we also detect the effect of environment in the stellar population properties of galaxies up to redshift 1. And this is a work that Laura is carrying on and with the publication in preparation. So matching the legacy sample with the Darvish et al. Catalog of environmental characterization. Here, environment can be characterized either in terms of the hierarchy of galaxies, so whether they are central or satellites in groups, in the location with respect to cosmic structures, so whether galaxies are in a cluster, in the filament, or in the field, in the general field, or a continuous parameter such as the overdensity. And in general, we see that, yes, there is an environmental dependence already in place at this redshift, but for example, some differences with respect to the local universe, such that satellites and central galaxies appear to be similar at lower masses as opposed to what we see in the local universe. While galaxies that are located in cluster or that are located systematically in more dense regions are older with respect to equally massive galaxies in less dense environments. And the interesting thing is that when we control for all parameters, the overdensity appears to be the main driver of a peak stellar mass of the stellar population property, the age of galaxies, such that when controlling for hierarchy, satellite central galaxies, and the location in the cosmic web, the dependence on the overdensity persists. Okay, so the other thing that we want to understand is eventually how these scaling relations actually evolve. And we are in the right position to do that because we have processed SDSS data, which are also, I remind you, aperture corrected, and legacy data with the same modeling approach and same spectroscopic constraints. So this is a very important thing to keep in mind when comparing results at different redshifts or for different surveys. And here I'm showing the age versus stellar mass relation. The contours show SDSS, so present-day galaxies, and the points are legacy galaxies. This is for the general population. This is split into quiescent and star-forming galaxies. So as I said, we see similar bimodal distribution in age, but with the transition mass that is shifted 0.4 dex higher at intermediate redshift with respect to the local universe, which reflects the overall increase, the growth of the old passive population in the present-day universe. But we also see that the difference between the median relations is actually significantly smaller than the time elapsed between redshift 0.7 and redshift 0.1, which we would expect to be at the order of 5 giga a year. Instead, is on average of the order of 2.5 giga a year, also for the massive passive galaxies. So this is in contrast with the simple passive evolution for the average population, indicating that some addition of young stars from residual star formation or from accretion or from quenching of the star-forming galaxies must occur. Another interesting thing to notice is that if we do not account for aperture effect, so we just restrict to the central region of present-day galaxies, this difference increases by about 1 giga a year. So part of the non-passive evolution can be attributed to the accretion of young stars in the outer part of galaxies. And for what concerns the metallicity, again, I'm showing similar plots of the stellar metallicity mass relation for the general population, quiescent and star-forming galaxies. And we see that, yeah, star-forming galaxies show an increase toward low redshift of their metallicity, which is up to 0.2 dex at low stellar masses, which partly agrees with other studies that predicted evolution based on the average star formation history and the fundamental metallicity relation, but is actually somewhat larger. And the other interesting thing is that instead quiescent galaxies in general have a metallicity that is consistent with the local populations. So we have to reconcile the non-passive aging that we have showed before with a mild or absent metallicity evolution. So the addition of new stars must not affect the measured stellar metallicity in galaxies. So again, this can happen both through evolution of individual galaxies through addition of small amount of stars, or maybe through divergers, and evolution of the population through quenching of the low star formation rate massive galaxies that already have a metallicity that is comparable to the quiescent population. So both individual evolution and evolution of the population in agreement with the number density evolution of galaxies seems to occur. I will go quickly through this prospect for the near future in this redshift interval. We're waiting for the WEAVE step survey to start. This is eventually we'll gather a sample of 20,000 I-band selected galaxies in the redshift range between 0.3 and 0.8 with the WEAVE telescope, reaching a target T0 noise of 10. And the deeper counterpart with Foremost, which is the Foremost waves and the Foremost steps survey, in particular Foremost steps, is going to target 3,500 galaxies with the same I-band selection, and again the redshift range 0.3 to 0.7 with 30-hour integration, so reaching exquisite signal to noise for this large sample of galaxies, combined with a very detailed characterization of the environment from the WAVES deep survey. And so these surveys are actually going to effectively bridge the SDSS observation at redshift 0 with the legacy observation at redshift 0.7 and combining galaxy properties with the environment. I'm going to very quickly here at higher redshift instead. I haven't talked about what happens at higher redshift, but of course there is much to learn from the chemical properties and in general the stellar population properties of massive galaxies at higher redshift. So far these studies are limited to the quiescent populations, and as you know, GWC is now giving a very strong kick in these studies, and there are at least 3 surveys that are performing deep near-spectral spectroscopy of massive quiescent galaxies at redshift, at various redshift, the Excel survey, the Suspense led by the group of Mariska Creek, and also the Deep Dive survey targeting somewhat larger redshift between redshift 3 and 4, extended then with archival observation of other 140 massive quiescent galaxies. I'm just showcasing here the variety of information that can be extracted from these spectra in terms of the total metallicity and abundance ratios of these galaxies that will need to be confronted with a lower redshift counterpart. One thing to keep in mind is, of course, that measuring abundances in these high redshift galaxies, which have very young stellar populations intrinsically, is very challenging and subject to large uncertainties, and actually would require also improvement in the base population synthesis models. And I think I'm running out of time, but I only want to here give you an overview of what is going to come. So I've mentioned the formal steps and the WIP step survey, and for the higher redshift, we will soon also have moons, and eventually in the mosaic with ELT, and people are thinking ahead in the beyond the 2040s with the wide field spectroscopic telescopes. They're going to sample very, very large samples of galaxies in the intermediate redshift range, and to deeper and sharper near spectroscopy for a more detailed characterization of stellar populations in high redshift galaxies. I will leave you with my take-home messages. I hope I've shown you that the physical properties of stellar populations in galaxies are key constraints of their evolution through cosmic time. And still a number of open questions, of course, remain open. The main key message is that this is a multi-parameter problem, and galaxies go through multiple evolutionary channels. So this requires both accuracy in the parameter estimate, large statistics, and representative samples of galaxies if we want to meaningfully compare galaxy population at different redshifts. The future is promising, given the various spectroscopic surveys that are planned and facilities that are going to be we are going to use. And of course, the future is to think about dedicated wide field, high multiplex spectroscopy for very deep and large samples of galaxies at different redshifts. And I stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Right, thank you. I will open the floor to questions, especially students and postdocs. If you have any questions, I encourage you to be brave. I'll allow some awkward silence.
Hello, thank you for the talk. At the beginning, you said that you are using your own code, Basta. Have you checked how much your code impact in the values instead of using another ones?
Yes, yes, absolutely. That's a very important point. So the so actually, okay, in the work done in SDSS, so the nice thing of this approach is that it's actually computationally very fast. So this allows us to change the input assumptions relatively easily. And Daniela has actually performed a very extensive work in changing one by one the ingredient from this old rendition of the stellar population properties to the new one. Changing both the base simple stellar population models, the assumptions on the star formation history, and the chemical enrichment history and the treatment of dust. And all of these lead to some differences, especially the base population synthesis models and the assumption on the star formation histories, in particular whether they are exponentially declining or rising and falling. They have lead to very significant differences in the, well, yes, quite significant difference in the age of the stellar populations. And the metal enrichment history is somewhat also on the stellar metallicity. In legacy, we've also performed similar. So these are given the same observational constraints because that is another parameter factor that can change the results. In legacy, actually, we have both explored various prior model distribution within our code, as well as compared with other spectral fitting approaches that are also Bayesian, but a different type of approach, in particular in the sense that especially Prospector allows for a non-parametric star formation histories, so it does not assume a priori a shape of the star formation history. And we have actually performed extensive comparison in these three derived parameters. The individual parameters show a quite significant scatter between them, but the general trend are much more consistent with respect to what you would expect from the simple one-to-one comparison. And in fact, I mean, yes, there are also other work published, especially in these two papers, basically finding a very similar overall trends. But if you want to look for subtle differences, then of course the method that you adopt is absolutely very important. Yes, there are some uncertainties that we cannot really know. For example, without assuming a prior a shape of the star formation histories. I mean, the early epoch of the star formation remains mostly unknown, even at this redshift, because we're dominated by the light of the younger star population.
More questions?
Thank you for your comprehensive talk. I have kind of a naive question. You mentioned at the end of your talk how difficult it is to calibrate the metallicity, to find right calibration for the metallicity. And this has a huge impact even for setting up population of massive binary stars and compact objects, etc., etc. So, in your opinion, up to which redshift we can be kind of confidently sure that we are doing the right thing if we use the metallicity calibration from the fundamental plane? And what kind of calibration should we consider more reliable than others?
In terms of redshift, I think that's so basically for populations that are older than 1 or maybe a couple of gig a year, that means that yeah, maybe Redshift 2, I mean, of course, it remains difficult, intrinsically difficult, um, but it's reasonable. At this redshift, it starts to be difficult because even the most massive quiescent galaxies are approaching an average age of 1.5 giga a year. And this is where, at the moment, the population synthesis models start to be less reliable. Which is the most reliable calibration? To be honest, I don't have an answer to that. We really have to rely on the development of models for younger stellar populations. There are crucial also at lower redshift to model the extended star formation histories of the star-forming galaxies, but of course it becomes especially crucial at higher redshift. Yeah, I think this still it's going to be something to work on from the population synthesis models side.
All right. Maybe one last question. Okay. If not, then the speaker is visiting at least till tomorrow and also
actually Thursday as well.
Thursday.
I'm going to be
Good.
at MPIA Thursday morning.
Good. And there will be at Bachan. So if you're interested in joining, please come down and talk to Anna. So with that, let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you. Thank you.